For our last video in the Skyward Sword countdowns, we got the dungeons. They've added a lot of puzzles and stuff in very small dungeons, which makes them longer than you would expect. In general, the dungeons are very well designed and there aren't really any dungeons that we dislike really much. There are of course some dungeons that are better than others, but you will see that. Let's get right to it. We're the owners of Triforce, I'm owner 2, and this is our top 7 dungeons in Skyward Sword. Our first entry on this list is the Skyview Temple. The first dungeon in the game, and it actually offers a good amount of complexity and puzzles. The puzzles are both simple and complex at the same time, a good variety. Even though there aren't many rooms in this dungeon, it still feels like it's quite long, which is very positive. It just shows that even though the dungeon isn't that big, it can still take a decent amount of time to complete. The colors in the dungeon and the atmosphere blend well together. A very good first dungeon, to be honest. The third dungeon in the game, Lanayru mining facility, takes our 6th spot on this list. A very unique dungeon with the time shift stones. You can go back in time in certain locations with just a crystal. Sweet. The music, however, is a bit annoying, at least in the present time, when everything is just brown and depressing. It does get a bit better when you go back in time with the time shift stones, when everything is colorful and lively. The whole dungeon is a technological place. A bit too much tech stuff for us, but it's okay. It's really cool how it can go from colorless and, let's not say depressing, let's say not that interesting, to colorful and lively but just going back in time. Well, it's not a bad dungeon, but it just doesn't hold up to our expectations. The Earth Temple is a decent dungeon. It got cool caves, cool statues, very good music, and an overall good fire theme, even though it's named Earth Temple. You have dragon statues, little foes, which blends in really well with the dungeon since they spew fire. And you got lava, which adds to the good fire theme of this dungeon. You meet the Mogmas here who help you along the way. There are rocks that you can balance on to get over the lava. Again, not a very big dungeon, but they made it feel like it's bigger than it is, which makes it even more interesting. Plus, who doesn't love getting chased by a rolling boulder Indiana Jones style? It's very interesting to see all the dragon themes here, and have the boulder, which actually turns out to be the boss, roll through a dragon's mouth and along the bones of a dead one. Overall, a well designed dungeon. In Zelda dungeons, there are a lot of puzzles to be solved in many different rooms. But what if the dungeon itself is a huge puzzle? That's the Skykeep. The whole dungeon is just a big puzzle, while moving rooms so you can access them and going back, moving them even more to access new parts, is just plain awesome. It takes a lot from the previous dungeons, which has become a theme for the last dungeons in the Zelda games lately. Not a bad thing at all, in our opinion. It's very complex because of the dungeon being a big puzzle itself. We're not sure if you can actually do the dungeon in different ways or if there's just one way to do it. We only did a certain way, haven't tried beating the dungeon in another way. But if it's beatable in different ways, then that's just awesome. Yeah, this dungeon can be really confusing. It's weird to not have a boss in a final dungeon like this, but it does take stuff from previous dungeons, which is something we really like. A really good final dungeon to the game. At first glance, the Sandship just looks like a normal place, not a dungeon at all. But the fact that the dungeon is a huge ship is awesome. Again, you can fit a lot of stuff on a ship that looks like it would have been a small dungeon. Can't say it enough, they did a great job on that part with the dungeons in this game. In this dungeon, like Lanayru mining facility, there are timeshift stones. But there's only one timeshift stone which has to be accessed from different places on the ship. Since it's so high up, you can only get it with the bow and arrows, which is the item in this dungeon. You get the bow very early on in the dungeon, and that the bow is the item you mostly use in this dungeon is a bit disappointing. But the bow is useful and is used in a good way. We really like how this is pirate themed. There are hostages, machinery, heck, even a pirate mini-boss. The way you discover the dungeon is cool as well, since you have to shoot bombs at it while it's invisible. A really good dungeon. This dungeon is really cool. The Fire Sanctuary is the 6th dungeon in the game, and damn is it good. It got good music, again really good fire theme. It's actually a dungeon with fire in its name this time. There are a lot of underground passages in here with the help of the Mogmas, as they're in this dungeon too. And you get the Mogma mitts, an upgraded version of the digging mitts, which allows you to get access to these underground passages. The buildings in these dungeons are really awesome. They remind us of Blood Oath buildings from another game, World of Warcraft. The items you have are put to good use in this dungeon, with a good variety of what items you need to use. At the end of the dungeon, you got a really neat puzzle, which requires you to jump off into a huge gap and land on one of the faces down there. I had so much trouble with this. I didn't know what to do. Jumped off into nothing and just lost hearts here and there. A really well made dungeon. Our number 1 spot goes to the ancient Cistem. For us, this is the best dungeon in the game. It's got 2 parts, the upper part, which is beautiful and generally looks nice and peaceful, and then you got the lower part, which is totally different from the upper part. The lower part is dark and got a really creepy atmosphere. You might have to say that the lower part is maybe one of the creepiest places after the Skyview Temple of Ocarina of Time. This dungeon is supposed to be based off something from the Buddhism. This dungeon too got a really nice variety of the item usage. Good music, and the swimming parts in this dungeon actually feels good. But the most important part of this dungeon is what I've already said, the contrast from the upper part to the lower part. Feels like heaven and hell, to be honest, where clear and clean water flows around the giant sacred statue, while the only liquid you find underneath is poisonous and flows around hellish creatures and freaky faces in the stones. Freaking awesome dungeon with the upper and lower parts and music, with good item usage too.